somebody that I was working with, she loved my ideas, but even she, one day she called me up and said, "Oh, I'm so excited because I've got this 3-star Michelin chef and he's going to write all our menus." And I was like, well, it's not about tempting people with anorexia to eat nicer food. It's about understanding why they are blocked off.
G'day and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. After discussing anorexia at length with those affected both directly and indirectly by the condition, we are now moving on to talking about the recovery sector in the anorexia field. My guest today is author and psychotherapist Matthew Campling. During lockdown, Matthew released his book, Diary of a Male Anorexic, which covers his journey with the condition and also his recovery from it. In this episode, I talk with Matthew about his thoughts on the anorexia recovery sector, both from his personal experience as someone having gone through the recovery sector, but also now from his perspective as a psychotherapist in the field. Hello, Matthew, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Hi from London.
Yeah, g'day. Let's start with your book, Diary of a Male Anorexic. How did it come to be?
In terms of the literary side of things, after I recovered from anorexia, I then became a writer and a psychotherapist. So when we went into lockdown, gloom, I thought, well, I'll write it as a diary. So although it's called Diary of a Male Anorexic, there was never an actual diary. Recreated the circumstances on a day-by-day basis. I enjoy writing in a diary form. And so that's allowed me to give an overview of what happened, which at the time, obviously, it wouldn't have had that same sense of what's going on here. So the book is in 5 sections. So the first section is how I got anorexia. The second section is how I recovered. The third is an overview of my understanding and my personal experience of anorexia and what I think an eating disorder is really about versus what a lot of the recovery places seem to be banging out. And then the fourth and fifth parts is obviously after anorexia, because sometimes in a book you read about somebody's experience and you think, well, what happened next? So I was living in South Africa. In fact, my parents, when I was 8, we were living in England, and they had the opportunity of either emigrating to Australia or to South Africa. And I so wish they had gone to Australia because I had a terrible time growing up in South Africa. I got overweight. I got bullied all the time. Once I discovered diet and exercise, that's when the anorexia began to kick in. If you imagine that it's like a blind something or other, it can't think outside the idea of exercising and dieting. It's dysfunctional. It's a mechanism. It's like, when you have a thing that automatically shuts the door and you put a wedge in the door to stop the door doing its automatic function. That's kind of like the mechanism. All it can do is shut the door or say, no, dieting and exercise. And when I started working with people with anorexia and bulimia, and I went to some of the recovery units that they have here in London, I was just appalled because they don't have that sensitive understanding that it's an illness inside. They see it in terms of, oh, this child is not eating. What we have to do is make this child eat. And when I did part of a master's in eating disorder recovery at the Tavistock Clinic, which I can talk about because the Tavistock Clinic is now closed, 2 of the women there worked for a very well-known, high-profile health organization where they get like celebrities who go in there to detox and whatever. And these 2 worked in the anorexia, and their idea of recovery was that once a week, the people in the recovery unit had to go through a menu and choose a main meal and a pudding, and then they'd all go to this restaurant and they would all have to eat all that food. That is not recovery, because what would happen is they'd come back, either they would exercise in their rooms until that sense of being overstuffed burned off, or they would lie in their beds feeling the distress of having all that food inside them. And this is a unit where people are being paid thousands a week to manage the recovery. I was working as a therapist in private practice, and my clients were coming for one session a week usually, and frankly, my recovery rates were a lot better than these in-house situations where they've got the patient in there for 24 hours a day, and this is how they behave. For example, if they lose weight, then they take away their pillow. So the whole thing is about punishment. If they put a bit of weight on, then they can go home. But if when they're at home they take the weight off, then when they come back, they get punished.
Seems like an almost just make them eat mentality, like you were kind of like you described in the recovery centres. And I can see that would be a really unhelpful kind of approach, just because I think it's not fixing the psychological problems part of it. Is that kind of what you were kind of saying?
That's right. Yes, it's not understanding the psyche, how the psyche is working. It's taking somebody with anorexia and looking at them from the outside and going, oh, they're not eating, therefore we've got to make them eat. And as you say, that's not it at all. It needs to be, you need to step back and say, why is this happening? How is the psyche functioning? And what I relate it to is, if you suffer from hay fever and your nose blocks up, that's actually the body trying to protect you from having the pollen come into the body. But we can't function like that. So we take tablets to work against what the body is trying to do. So that shows that there are certain things in our psyche that are set up, but they don't work well in practice. And so that's what I say is the point about an eating disorder, both overweight and underweight, is that it's set up to help the person, but it doesn't in practice, which is why we then need to do something to work against it. But when I say against it, I don't believe in attacking it. I used to lie on my bed when I was really, really thin and ill and talk to the anorexic part of myself and say, it's all right, I'm not trying to hurt you. I don't hate you. I just need you to let me eat more so that I can carry on.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some good points there too, like not to attack it. I mean, and that brings me to the point of like, how should family members kind of approach this? Like, because I think some of them would probably have that kind of mentality of, well, let's just attack this thing and let's just, get rid of it. But that might not be the best way to go about it. So how should family members go about it?
If they don't come from the idea that it's the dysfunctioning self-defense of the psyche, then are they always going to be looking at it from the outside? Now, somebody that I was working with, she loved my ideas, but even she, one day she called me up and said, oh, I'm so excited because I've got this 3-star Michelin chef and he's going to write all our menus. And I was like, well, it's not about tempting people with anorexia to eat nicer food. It's about understanding why they are blocked off from eating the food. So you see what I mean? Even somebody who was interested in my ideas fell into the trap of, well, it's about making them eat. In the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War, when the Allied troops liberated the concentration camps, and of course there were many, there's thousands of people who were severely emaciated, they tried to feed them with a lot of food, and they died because the body was incapable of absorbing all the food after having been starved for so long. And basically that's like when somebody has anorexia, they need to be given a little food, so that the body can absorb it rather than being forced to eat a lot of food.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is author and psychotherapist Matthew Campling, where we are discussing the anorexia recovery sector. I'd imagine then with that in mind, you'd have to, like the recovery sector, whatever they're doing, they would have to be very careful not to give more than the body can take kind of thing.
Well, you would think so, but I've read the website where they're talking about, and if the person doesn't gain a kilogram a week, then we will give them a tube down their throat into their stomach to make sure that they're getting all the nutrients they need. And no. So what happens is I saw an interview with some of these kids, and the kids are bloated and they're frightened. Their eyes are absolutely terrified because they are fighting the illness inside them and the aggression and the lack of understanding from outside. So rather than the person with anorexia having the power, they're actually being attacked from both sides. After I published my first book, I went down and did a lecture, and there was a young woman who was there afterwards, wrote me an email saying, at last, Matthew, somebody who understands. And I've been through recovery centers, and I would put the weight on so that they would let me out, and then when I got home, I would obey the anorexia and then take the weight off again. And you also get, in terms of the overweight side, Weight Watchers. Now, I can't have this confirmed, but something like 93% of the people in Weight Watchers are returnees. In other words, they've been in Weight Watchers, they've taken the weight off, and now they've come back because they put the weight on again. So again, it's not just about standing and getting taps if you've taken off weight. It's about understanding what role either overeating or undereating is doing for the individual, but it's a dysfunctional way of doing it, which is why it needs to be carefully and sensitively addressed.
When it comes to like people around those that are going through anorexia, what kind of things, and especially as someone yourself who's gone through it now and is now in the recovery sector, what should people be careful about in what they say to those with anorexia? I could imagine there'd be certain things you could say that would kind of trigger it a bit. What do you think about all that?
The trouble is that I have worked with people with anorexia who were so defensive that it didn't matter what you said to them, because it was actually coming from the anorexic voice itself. So there was one young woman, she was very attractive and well-groomed, and then I said something and she snapped at me. And I thought, wow, that's the voice of the EDM, the eating disorder mechanism. When you have, so if you take an imaginary scenario of a mother and her daughter, although of course nowadays 10% of people with anorexia are male, as of course I was. But if we take the mother and the daughter scenario, so the daughter has anorexia, she's sitting in her room, she's maybe visiting pro-ana websites. Do you know about those?
Pro-anorexia websites, did you say?
Yeah, there are pro-anorexia where these young people write about how being anorexic is the only way to live. And of course, the awful thing is that these people, these adolescents, are in their rooms because they're too distressed and frightened to go out. So my God, the idea of living like that, living in one room, entirely dependent upon your parents and fighting with them all the time because they're concerned. This is no life. Anyway, so if we have that scenario and the mother comes in and says something like, I am beginning to understand that you are battling something inside you. I know that I'm not going to help you by saying something like, put on weight, or do you know how awful you look? Because that doesn't help. But what I need from you, what I would like from you, not need, but what I would like from you is some acknowledgement of the reality of what's going on. Because, you're just sitting in your room all day and working on the computer, and this is your childhood, this is your teenagehood. That's all you're going to have to look back on. And if you can just move your sense of fear and your sense of defensiveness from go away, I know what I'm doing, to there's something going on inside me that frightens me, then we might have something that we can begin to work with. But even then, you see, the anorexic voice, not only very powerful, it's also very frightened. And so it needs to be done with a lot of awareness of the reality of the situation.
With that scenario, I think it's really illustrated. It sounds like it can anorexia, when it's like at that kind of point, it really can affect someone's daily life in like huge amounts.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, when I was doing the research for my master's, it was about 1% to 2% of adolescents who have an eating disorder. And although that's not a very high percentage, when you are that 1% to 2%, it's a catastrophe. And not only the person, but the family around them. I spoke to a woman whose daughter she's a living skeleton. She's a lovely, lovely person, but she's a living skeleton. And she loves my book. She loves the ideas in my book. But she was in a recovery center, which was basically like a prison. And she said that after she had a meal, she would like to be taken in a car and taken in the countryside and look at the flowers. And so, in other words, have healthy, healing images. But she was stuck in this, we were sitting in this awful, grey, prison-like courtyard talking. But her mother I spoke to, and her mother was like, I just can't do it anymore. I've got 4 children, and this one, she comes out of the recovery unit, she takes the weight off again, she goes back again. It was like she was completely burnt out. And the trouble, the particular trouble there is that you have somebody who's burnt out because they aren't qualified to deal with their daughter or their son's situation. But then they rely on the experts. And where is that expert coming from? I was speaking to somebody a couple of years ago who was talking, she was a psychiatrist, and she was talking about this wonderful relationship she had with this guy who was anorexic. And she was treating him using analysis, and he died. And it's like, for F's sake, you know, if you're treating somebody with analysis and then they die, shouldn't you look at the treatment that you're using and say maybe the treatment isn't working? And of course the treatment's not working, because with the analytic approach, they take everything and they create a little story about it. And they make it about, well, this is the Freudian theory that goes with it. But that doesn't help the actual problem.
In the recovery sector, how can we really make it better? Like, what needs to happen? Like, I mean, like, and how can we have this?
Well, I mean, overall, a proper understanding of what the situation is. Like in this recovery center that I was talking about, the horror place, in their manifesto on the internet, they say our inmates will gain 1 kilogram a week, whatever happens. We have to move from that understanding to say how we understand the illness is that it is a dysfunctioning defense mechanism, and that the person themselves is not the problem, that this mechanism is the problem. And so we need to encourage gently the person to actively work with the mechanism and say, I know that you're trying to help, but you're not helping, so please let me have some of that energy back. And I'll go for a walk, but in order to go for a walk, you have to let me eat. And so a negotiation, as I did, but so teaching it the way that you would teach meditation, you'd teach yoga, something that is about nurturing the body and nurturing the psyche.
It seems as though recovery is not about how quickly someone recovers in that sense. It's
even that, Jack. Let me just jump in here, because when I had the illness, I used to weigh myself all the time. So the weighing machine took on a big ritual importance. And if I put on a pound, then I felt bad and I'd do more exercise. If I'd taken off a pound, then I'd feel great. So the weighing machine, when I started recovering, I stopped weighing myself. The last thing you want to know is for something mechanical to be telling you, oh yeah, you weigh this, oh yeah, you weigh that, because you don't know what it means. Is it about, what time of day is it? Is it about how much you've eaten or haven't eaten? But in these recovery centers, from what I understand, it's all about how much you weigh. It's all written down. It's all charts. It's all you weigh this much, and then you weigh that much. And there's no sense of, particularly when these are adolescents, adolescents are growing. So, of course, their weight is moving around because they're adding to their actual structure. So you just go, oh, you've taken off 2 pounds and you know you're not supposed to put the 2 pounds on. That's such a primitive way of approaching the situation.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is author and psychotherapist Matthew Campling, where we are discussing the anorexia recovery sector. When we view anorexia, with it, we shouldn't view it as like with the different genders. We shouldn't say, oh, well, this is how it affects males and this is how it affects females. We should say, well, like everyone's different kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question why it is that predominantly it's women rather than men. But so far, I haven't seen anything that would give the key in terms of, oh, right, that's why it is. I would think that it's to do with sensitivities. The person that I was talking about, my heterosexual client, was an artist. And so there might be something about the sensitivities that are opened up by the artistic way of seeing life. There might be something there, but as I say, it's not something I've got enough information on.
What made you want to get help? Like, what was the moment you kind of said you needed to get help with this?
Well, as I write in my diary, so there was one day when my mother was getting a new weighing machine, and I was really excited to go on this new weighing machine and to weigh even less. And so I forced myself to go running and starved myself, and then I got on this new machine, and I thought that I would be rewarded. And then when I looked at what I weighed, which was like 91 pounds, instead of feeling happy, I suddenly thought, oh, I am really ill. I am really ill, and I don't know what to do about it. And that was just before I had my breakdown. So in other words, if the person themselves comes to the understanding that they are ill, then you can do something about it with a lot more effectiveness, because then the person themselves wants to recover. What I think happens is that the person goes into defensive by being told from the outside, you need to put on weight. So what we need to find is the way in which the person can come to that conclusion. And for me, in the people that I've been speaking to, it's because they recognized what I was saying, the reality of what they were experiencing. So because I was just saying, look, this is my experience, they were picking up on that and saying, yeah, that makes sense. What I've been being told by doctors just hasn't made sense.
And have you found that a lot of people, they find it hard to ask for that initial help?
Well, it depends on what. I mean, the thing about specifically anorexia is that it's visible. The person doesn't have to. I mean, the people around them usually are the first ones to. So when I was taking weight off, and I loved the fact that I just got slimmer as well, I just take my clothes off and go, wow, look how thin I am. And then my mother would say, oh, you're really thin. Why don't you eat something nurturing? And my brothers used to say, Matthew, you look like something out of a concentration camp, which didn't help.
No.
It just made me more defensive. And it's very upsetting to hear that. So what we need to do is find a way that the person can come on board, because they will be missing out on things. They will have a sense of, if all you can do, like I was doing, was exercise and then go and sit in my room and diet and do more exercise. And I didn't used to go to sleep. I would black out from lack of energy. There could have been a way that I could have been approached, but it has to be the right way. And it's finding that right way. But for me, I did have to first realize that I was ill. And I think that's probably the most important key moment to the beginning of recovery.
Yeah, I know. I'm just thinking from a family's point of view, it sounds like they can help to a certain point, but that person that has it needs to kind of realize that in themselves if they're really going to recover.
Yeah, and it is difficult, because obviously the family don't immediately become specialists. in anorexia, specialist in eating disorder recovery. It is hugely, I mean, my mother did try. She sent me to our doctor, and the doctor said, well, I look really thin and healthy. I mean, she was really pissed off about that. What you sometimes get with anorexia is you'll have like a family therapy model. So the whole family will go. And I can't say anything for or against that. It's just that is an established model. But what they do say is that if a family is dysfunctional, then the anorexic is the one who exhibits that family dysfunction. And certainly my family was dysfunctional. However, I'm not saying that every family with an anorexic member is dysfunctional. But the way in which the family reacts to the person with anorexia has some bearing. I mean, obviously, if my brothers had said to me, Matthew, we're worried because you've taken off a lot of weight and you spend all your time dieting and exercising, then there might have been an emotional connection at that point. But hearing you look like something out of a concentration camp just cut off any possibility that the family could help. So there is a possibility that the family members, if they are sympathetic, if they can set their own feelings aside and think about, well, what will be helpful for the person to hear. But it doesn't help the person to hear, you look really, really thin. There's a guy on television, Jeremy Kyle, who's now being kicked off television because somebody died after something that had been set up on his program. But I remember once watching it, and it was Anorexic, and he was saying to this young woman, you know, men like curves. And I thought, my God, this man is running a therapeutically oriented show, and he can say men like curves to a young woman with anorexia. First of all, maybe she doesn't like men. And number two, hearing that kind of pressure, how is that supposed to help her? Oh, men like curves, so therefore I'll start eating again.
In saying that, I mean, do you think that the way that we kind of, in society, we kind of view weight and like we like kind of, I mean, there's almost like this strive for like, you know, you can't look big or like, I mean, is the way...
Well, I mean, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I think people like Lizzo, she's an American, brilliant writer, singer. She's a big woman, and she has just turned the whole size situation on its head, because she's so gorgeous and she's so dynamic and she's so clever, and she surrounds herself with big women, and they're all fantastic. They can all dance. They can all, they're full of energy and life, and it's such a kick in the eye, or what would you call it, a poke in the eye, for this whole thing about, oh, you've got to be slim, oh, you've got to be this, you've got to, if you want love, then you've got to look like that. And we need more of that. And that's happening on the big side. And then in terms of anorexia, Christina Aguilera did a song called Beautiful. And the song itself is lovely. It's a beautiful song. But I was very angry with the video, because in the video it had a woman, a young woman who was anorexic. And so what she was saying, that anorexia is beautiful, I mean, that's a problem, because anorexia is an illness. It's like saying, oh my God, cancer is really beautiful. No, it's not. It will destroy the person. We need to find a healthy and balanced attitude.
The thing that we identify as the solution, like you mentioned in the video, how that it may seem positive at first, everyone's beautiful, but in some ways, when you kind of put anorexia in that category, that can't be very helpful, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like saying, "Oh, self-harm is beautiful."
Yeah.
I think I'm very passionate about eating disorder recovery, because I've been on both sides of it. But what I found when I was working is so private practice was great, and people would find their way to me, and they would, for a modest amount, I would really put a lot into the work that I did with them. But I couldn't find a recovery center that wanted to take on my way of seeing things, because there is so much established, but that established way of working, they talk about the third. So a third of people, they say, get better. A third aren't changed, and a third get worse. So in other words, 2/3 of people are not affected by their recovery method. So why don't they change the method?
From kind of all we've kind of spoken about, like, what would you want our listeners to kind of get from this? Like, what would be the take-home message?
That if they are around somebody who has anorexia, or if they are somebody is anorexic, that it's not the person themselves that's doing it, that it's the EDM, the eating disorder mechanism, which is a dysfunctional part of the defense mechanism of the psyche, that is doing this. It is saying, if you don't eat and if you exercise, then you will feel good, right? So therefore, once you understand the basis of the illness, then you can start to gently unpick the work, to take back its energy. So it's a process. It's not something that you can control from the outside. And it's something where you very definitely need the person to understand how they can help themselves.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today, Matthew. I think we spoke about such important things, and yes, I just want to say thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much.
My guest today was Matthew Campling, an author and psychotherapist. Tune in next week when we speak with expert Carolyn Costin about anorexia recovery. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.